through the fire, I will follow thee. I will follow thee. I will follow whither thou goest, dear Lord, I will follow. Many people in Jesus' times followed along with him just for the loaves and the fishes. There were the curiosity seekers, or those who come along for the ride, but many and most who didn't mean business. And when Jesus made it perfectly plain to them what it meant to be a Christian, a disciple, a follower, the Word of God tells me that many left following and never followed him anymore. And it's a challenge to you and me today in our Christian living, in our experience. When the things get going and get rough, will we say, well, Jesus, I'm like the crowd that you preached to long ago. It's a way that's too hard for me. It's a price that's too high for me to pay. And it's a cost that I'm not prepared to make. And a sacrifice that I don't believe that I'll give. Or are you like the blessed few who have said, Jesus, I'll go with you all the way. I will follow you, Lord. Wherever you go, Lord, wherever I see your footprints before me, that's the way that I'll go to, Lord. Hallelujah. For thee is my desire. I will follow thee through the flood or through the fire. Yes, I will follow thee. I will follow thee. I will follow thee. Whither thou goest, dear Lord, I'll go. Yes, I will follow thee. Would you say with me right now and sing the verse with me? Yes, Lord, I'll follow you. All the way, Lord. Through the fire, through the flood, through the water, through any test or trial, God, by the grace of God, I'll follow the Lord. Hallelujah. I will follow thee. Yes, I will follow thee. Whither thou goest, dear Lord, I'll go. I will follow thee. I would love to tell you what I think of Jesus, since I found in him a friend so strong and true. I would tell you how he changed my life completely, He did something that no other friend could do. No one ever cared for me like Jesus. There's no other friend so kind as He. No one else can take the sin and darkness from me. Oh, how much He cared for me. All my life was full of sin, and when Jesus found me, all my heart was full of misery and woe. Jesus placed His strong and loving arms around me. And He led me in the way I ought to go. No one ever cared for me like Jesus. There's no other friend so kind as He. No one else can take the sin and darkness from me. Oh, how much He cared for me. Every day He comes to me with new assurance. More and more I understand His word of love. But I'll never know just why He came to save me till someday I see His blessed face up above. No one ever cared for me like Jesus. There's no other friend so kind as He. No one ever take the sin and darkness from me. Oh, how much He cared for me. Every day He comes to me with new assurance. More and more I understand His word of love. But I'll never know just why He came to save me till someday I see His blessed face above. No one ever cared for me like Jesus. There's no other friend so kind as He. No one else can take the sin and darkness from me. Oh, how much He cared for me. Do you know my Jesus? Do you know my friend? Do you know that He loves you and that He will abide to the end? Do you know my Jesus? Do you know my friend? Do you know that He loves you and that He will abide to the end? There'll be light in the sky from the palace on high when I come Sweet relief from all care will be waiting me there when I come to the end of the road. When my long day is ended, my journey is on, I shall enter that blessed abode. For the Savior alone will be waiting for me when I come to the end of the road. Every long weary mile I'll recall with a smile when I come to the end of the road. And the foes that beset, God will make me forget when I come to the end of the road. When my long day is ended, my journey is on, I shall enter that blessed abode. For the Savior our Lord will be waiting for me when I come to the end of the road. As the Savior was walking up Calvary's hill, all the birds hushed their singing, all the leaves stood still, all the flowers in the field bowed their lovely head, while my Savior to Calvary was led. Tell me why did Jesus die on Calvary? Tell me why did he suffer such agony? For God so loved this world that he gave his only Son, and that is why Jesus died for you and me. They put nails in his hands, and they pierced his precious side. Oh, the pain was so great that pierced through his side. Yet he spoke not a word till the last breath he drew. Then he prayed, they know not what they do. Tell me Tell me why did Jesus die on Calvary? Tell me why did he suffer such agony? For God so loved this world that he gave his only Son, and that is why Jesus died for you and me. Tell me why did Jesus die on Calvary? Tell me why did he suffer such agony? For God so loved this world that he gave his only Son, and that is why Jesus died for you and me. Some people say that this old-time religion is just a thing of the past. But in this modern age that we're living, it's the only thing that will last. You may think I'm a little old-fashioned. Well, friend, that's all right with me. But I am so glad that I am a Christian, and from sin I have been set free. I know, there's no doubt about it, it's real in my soul, and I'm gonna shout it. I know, my sins are forgiven, and I'm on my way to a place that's called heaven. Not long ago at an old-fashioned meeting, I knelt on my knees in prayer. He lifted my burdens and shackles fell from me, and his presence was real everywhere. Now that the load I carried is lighter, and he changed the gray skies to blue, my steps are now higher, for I have his assurance that his sweet love will carry me through. I know, there's no doubt about it, it's real in my soul, and I'm gonna shout it. I know, my sins are forgiven, and I'm on my way to a place that's called heaven. Come go with me to a land over yonder, he's prepared for the pure and the true. It's a place where sickness and death cannot enter. I know, brother, how about you? Maybe today or maybe tomorrow you'll return in a robe of pure white. I'm packing up now, getting my things all together. Who knows, he may come tonight. No, I know, there's no doubt about it, it's real in my soul, and I'm gonna shout it. I know, my sins are forgiven, I'm on my way to a place that's called heaven. If I can help somebody as I pass along, then my living shall not be in vain. If I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a word or song, if I can show somebody he is traveling wrong, then my living shall not be in vain. Then my living shall not be in vain. Then my living shall not be in vain. If I can help somebody as I pass along, then my living shall not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a Christian ought, if I can bring back beauty to a world of rot, if I can spread love's message that the Master taught, then my living shall not be in vain. Then my living shall not be in vain. Then my living shall not be in vain. If I can help somebody as I pass along, then my living shall not be in vain. Fill my cup, Lord, I lift it up, Lord. Come and quench this thirsting of my soul. Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Fill my cup, fill it up and make me whole. Here's my cup, Lord, I lift it up, Lord. Come and quench this thirsting of my soul. Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Here's my cup, fill it up and make me whole. My cup, Lord, I lift it up, Lord. Come and quench this thirsting of my soul. Bread of heaven. thy great salvation, so full and free. Thank you, Lord, for saving my soul. Thank you, Lord, for making me whole. Thank you, Lord, for giving to me thy great salvation, so full and free. Oh, he touched me, yes, he touched me, and oh, the joy that floods my soul. Something happened, and now I know he touched me and made me whole. Prayer is the key to heaven, but faith unlocks the door. Words are so easily spoken. Prayer without faith is like a boat without an oar. Have faith when you speak to the Master, all he asks you for. Prayer is the key to heaven, but faith unlocks the door. Have faith when you speak to the Master, that's all he asks you for. Prayer is the key to heaven, but faith unlocks the door. I will get the best that heaven has for me if I am a victor over sin. I just want a mansion like I'm promised in God's book. I don't want to barely make it in. There'll not be a cabin in glory, for gold will be the cheapest thing there. Inside the palace gate are mansions of state, and every child of God will be a multimillionaire. We'll all join in singing a story. And as we reign with Christ our King, we'll have the best of everything. We'll have no limits in that land. There'll be no cabins in that land. The dawn and felt that your life was worth living. Can you call I'm your friend? How long has it been since you knew that he cared for you? Jesus, my Lord, will love me forever. From him no power of evil can sever. He gave his life to ransom my soul. Now I belong to him. Now I belong to Jesus. Jesus belongs to me. Not for the years of time alone, but for eternity. Once I was lost in sin's degradation. Jesus came down to bring me salvation, lifted me up from sorrow and shame. Now I belong to him. Now I belong to Jesus. Jesus belongs to me. Not for the years of time alone, but for eternity. Joy floods my soul, for Jesus has saved me, freed me from sin that long had enslaved me. His precious blood he gave to atone. Now I belong to him. Now I belong to Jesus. Jesus belongs to me. Not for the years of time flow to the sea? And who hung the moon in the starry sky? Somebody bigger than you and I. Who made the flowers bloom in the spring? And who writes the song for the robins to sing? And who sends the rain when the earth is dry? Somebody bigger than you and I. He lights the way when the road is long to keep you company, with love to guide you. He walks beside you, just like he walked with me. When I am weary and filled with despair, who gives me courage to go on from there? And who gives me faith that will never die? Somebody bigger than you and I. He lights the way when the road is long to keep you company, with love to guide you. He walks beside you, just like he walked with me. When I am weary and filled with despair, now who gives me courage to go on from there? And who gives me faith that will never die? Somebody bigger than you and I. The King and I walk down life's road together, where many people go passing by. The greatest one and I, a lowly beggar, walk hand in hand. The King and I. Why he should care for me will always be a mystery. He holds the whole world in his hand, but what am I? And so my heart somehow can't help but wonder why we're together, the King and I. The King and I, not long ago were strangers. I walked alone, not even knowing why, until he came and put his Now we're not strangers, the King and I. Why he should care for me will always be a mystery. He holds the whole world in his hand, and what I'm on. And so my heart somehow can't help but wonder why we're together, the King and I. If I knew of a land where no sorrows ever came, where the weather was just right, and there were no sick or lame, where there'd be no goodbye, and the people live for I would sell all I have and move today. Well, I know of a land where joys are waiting, where the people live forever and for aye. To be one eternal day without a sorrow. And some morning when he calls, I'll move away. If I knew of a land where no dark clouds ever came, where the sky was always bright, and there be... Mrs. Louis McCollum, concerning the information about my father, his ancestry and related facts concerning him. And I'm going to let her describe it in her own words at this time.
This is Mrs. McCollum, this is John McCollum, Sr., and I met my husband several years ago, and he was from West Virginia. He was born at Bowles Mills in 1880, July the 7th. And he was one of 10 children. His father was John M. McCollum from Waynesburg. He was a physician and went to Sistersville in Middleburn first to practice. There he met Eliza Archer, whom he married. She was 16 years old at the time. And so they became the parents of 10 children, and my husband was the second child living. Their first child died just at the age of a few weeks. Then, my husband's father, Dr. McCollum, eventually died in Sistersville, and left Mrs. McCollum with 10 children. And the following summer, she lost the youngest child. Then she opened a boarding house.
What was his name?
Chauncey. Yes, the youngest child that died was named Chauncey. And then after Dr. McCollum's death, she ran a boarding house. And because she had those 10 children to support, and the following summer, the youngest child died, Chauncey. I think he was around 2 years old. And then, after a period of time, she married a veterinarian by the name of Dr. Rose. And then they lived in Sistersville for a while, and then they went to St. Mary's and lived there for a while, and then they came to Waynesburg, and they lived here for a while, and then Dr. Rose he got killed in an accident. And then, at the time that this was going on, and my husband lived at Sistersville, well, out of Sistersville, on a dairy farm with his aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Tommy Twyford. He lived there, I think, for about 3 years. Then he and the next boy, Robert, came to Waynesburg, where his father's people lived out on adjoining farms. And so he settled here, and he became a meat cutter. And he cut meat for several years in Waynesburg and different towns around. And then we were married in 1907, May the 22nd, 1907. And we had 3 children, 3 boys, John M., Lloyd A., and Wayne A. McCollum. And then my husband died in 1969, and at the age of 89 years. And then the next brother, Robert, that I mentioned before, he married and lived at Donora, and he died at the beginning of World War II. And then the third brother, Ora, I don't know, he married a girl from Donora, Ora. Okay. Yes, they had. I can't remember her last name, but they had 2 children, 2 daughters, Mary and Doss. Mm-hmm. And his widow and the 2 daughters are still married, are still living in Donora. And both daughters became school teachers, and they're now retired. And then his younger brother, the younger brother that was living, that lived in Donora, he was a meat cutter, and he sold products. What did he sell? And then he sold Jewel Tea products, and he died very suddenly of a heart attack. And then his wife, or his widow, lived several years, 5 or 6, and then she's eventually died. Yes, her name is Anna Lloyd, and they had I forget how many children they did have, 6 or 7. Let's see, was it Jim, Bill, and Jack, and Jack was killed in the war. He was a flyer, and the first time up in the air, he was shot down after being in the air just a half hour, and they brought him back to Donora and buried him. I'll rectify. I will rectify one statement I made. It was Bob that died in the Battle of Normandy. And then the oldest boy, Jim, died of a heart attack. Bill is living, and Jack is in Arizona, and Judson is in Donora. And Ruth lives in Donora. No, Ruth lives in Elizabeth. She's married and has a family, lives in Elizabeth, PA. And Jean and Bill make their home together. And my husband's brothers and sisters were, the oldest one was Bertha. She died in infancy. Then Molly and John, Robert, and Bernsey, and Fanny, and Margaret, and Latham, and Chauncey, and he died in infancy. And Latham was the one that they always called Peck, because they called him that after Peck's bad boy. He was always into mischief. Then my husband's grandfather, on his mother's side, died in camp, in Army camp, during the Civil War, and they brought him back to Archer's Chapel Cemetery to bury him, and he was the first one buried in that cemetery. And for several years, we had letters that he had written back when he was in camp, and he was so he was so homesick and everything, and he said in one of the letters he said, "I don't feel that I'll ever get back home," and he didn't, and so he would tell the boys how to go ahead with the farm work and try to make a living, and every so often there would be a rider come through Middleburn, and they would say that the Southerners were on the march, and they were pilfering. And back of the rocky riffle, that they always called the rocky riffle in the river there. And back in there was several self-made caves, just natural caves. And Mom McCollum said she didn't know how many times they would take the silverware and their valuables up there and hide them. And they would take their horses and the cattle and anything they had, and take them away up around the hills and hide them in hollows. And then
Neil, didn't they ask him for service in that farm?
yes, and yes, Neil Archer, my husband's grandfather, as I've been talking about, he was in the field plowing, and they came through, and that's the way they would take the men. They didn't do like they do now, and they took him right from the plow. He just begged to get to go home to say goodbye to them. They didn't let him do it. They just took him right on. Had a horse there for him, and that's the last when he went out that morning to work. That's the last he ever saw his family.
His wife's name was what?
His wife. Oh. And Neil Archer's wife's maiden name was Eliza Cookus. And my husband's father, Dr. McCollum, had an office at Sistersville. They owned a home there, and they had a big, I think they had about an acre in ground there, and they had their garden and everything. And he was educated at Western Reserve, and his father's name was John McCollum, also from Nineveh, PA. And in those times, they didn't have cars or anything like that, and they would go on horseback at any hour of the night. They'd hear someone outside, hello, yelling for the doctor. And he would go, and maybe the family wouldn't see him for 3 or 4 days. He either stayed until they got better or died. And one night he was coming home, and it was just like in a blizzard. It was windy and everything. And he thought there was a horse following him. And when he got home, he discovered that there was the ear tabs on his cap that was flopping up and down. It sounded like a horse going. During World War I, we moved to Youngstown, and Dad worked on war work. And when the armistice was declared, then we came back to Waynesburg, because right then and there, when it was declared, all the war work closed down. No job, no nothing. So we came back to Waynesburg, PA, and Dad worked then for a few weeks painting and paper hanging, and then he got a job with a commercial painter, and he worked for him for 3 or 4 years. Then he went into the wallpaper and picture framing business. And then in 1962, our shop and store was burned, and then we retired, and we lived down on South Cumberland Street ever since. And Neil Archer had a brother, Arthur. They always called him Uncle At, and he had 6 sons. There was Everett, and Lloyd, and Schuyler, and Charlie, and Jack, and Blaine. And the noted Polly Archer Cemetery, which is it's almost internationally known, it was just about a quarter of a mile away from the Archer Chapel, and Polly Archer, one of the old ancestors, was buried up there, and it had a big high iron fence around it and pine trees in it. And when they made up the history of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and that was very noticeably noticed in there, and it was very well known. And then over at the Archer's Chapel, that was just comprised of almost all archers. They had a settlement just for themselves, and the heat was just a big coal iron stove with coal in it, but later they got gas in it, and they had a nice little chapel there. And so many of the archers are buried up in Archer's Chapel Cemetery. And Tommy Twyford, my husband's uncle, whom we used to live with, ran a dairy farm, and my husband lived with them 3 or 4 years, and they had 8 children, 7 boys and a girl. They were Layman, and Lauren, and Frank, and Carrie, and one daughter, Zelma, Paul, Chauncey, and Victor. And they're all dead now except Paul and Zelma. We were always closer to Lloyd and Tempa, his wife, and every year, for many years, they always had a family reunion, which we always attended. And then they both died, and Arthur, the oldest son, died several years ago, leaving a family of a wife and 7 or 8 children. And the youngest son has become a well-known minister. And then Carrie and Alice, his wife, still live at Sistersville. When my husband, when they broke up the home after Dr. McCollum died, my husband and the next boy, Bob, went to live with his mother's brother, and they stayed there for a couple of years. And one day, John got homesick, and he thought he'd go down to St. Mary's and visit the family. That's where they went from, Sistersville. And that's where Ma also opened up a little eating place. And when he got down to where the house had been, he'd been down there once before. And then he came back up and went to Uncle Barnes back in. And so when he got down there, the house was empty. No one seemed to know where the McCollums were. He couldn't find any place. He didn't know what to do. He was only a kid, about 17. And he got on one of the river boats and came back up to Sistersville. And when they put the gangplank down, he was so eager to get off, he ran down it. And instead of making it on the shore, he jumped in the water up to his knees. But when he climbed out of the water, there was Uncle Tommy Twyford with his dairy truck. And he says, "Well, boy, where you going and where you been?" "Well," he says, "I've been down to St. Mary's and I can't find the family. I don't know where I'm going." Well, Uncle Tommy says, "You go to climb up in the truck." It wasn't a motor truck. It was a horse-drawn cart, what would you call it? Wagon. And he was delivering milk down there from his dairy. And they didn't wholesale it then; they retailed it. And he says, "Well, you climb up in the wagon," and he said, "You go out with me for a while." And he went out to Uncle Tommy Twyford's, and with all Uncle Tommy's many children, he was made one of the family. And he stayed there for 3 or 4 years. And he would drive Aunt Elle to wherever she wanted to go. He was the one to drive Aunt Elle to back and forth, Uncle Tommy's wife. And he never had to work in the dairy. And when they would go to town in the fall and the spring to outfit the children with clothing, John would go right along. And he said that when the first time they went, Uncle Tommy says, "Come on, John, you're in this bunch." "Oh," he says, "I don't have any money to buy any clothes. You come on." And he said he took him in with the rest of the boys, and he said, "Now you boys look the rack over, and whatever you see that fits you, that's what you're going to get." So he said, "John, get in there and get your suit." And Dad, he said, that's the first real suit he ever had. Always wore his pants and jackets. And he got this suit. And And then he outfitted him with underwear and socks and everything, just like he did his own boys. And then, that time after he'd been up for Tommy's, he must have been around. I don't know. He must have been around 15 or 16, and so when he came up here, he was 17. So he said to Uncle Tommy one day, he says, "I'm going to go up to my father's people, and maybe I can get something to do up there." But he says, "I've got to start out some of these days and make my living." And he says, "Well, now, John, don't you go unless you want to go. You stay here as long as you want to." Well, Uncle Tommy gave him money for his train fare up, and when he got off at West Union Station, it was dark. And, of course, yes, that's above Sycamore. And he was expecting to walk over the hill to Uncle Frank McCollum's place, which was about 2.5 miles from there. Yes, so anyway, the station master said, "Well, there'll be no more trains till morning. I'm going to shut up this place." He says, "You have no place to go. You just come down with me." And he says, I'll make you comfortable till morning, and then he says you can go over to Uncle Frank's." And it had snowed, and it was about 12 or 13 inches deep, and Dad had no overshoes or anything. And the station master, I can't recall his name, took him down, gave him his good hot supper, put him in a nice big feather bed, and gave him his breakfast. Now he says, "Don't you start out in the snow today unless you want to." He says, "It'd be an awful walk over that hill." Well, after come light, no, I suppose mid-forenoon, Dad started out. And so when he got over to Uncle Frank's, they had never seen him. And when Uncle Frank's wife, Aunt Jenny, came to the door, Dad says, "Is Mr. McCollum here?" "Yes, but he's up over the hill, salting the sheep and throwing hay down from around the stack for them, so they could get around the stack out of the storm." And she says, "It's so wet and cold, you come in." She didn't know who he was. So when they got inside, she says, "Who are you?" Well, he says, "I am John McCollum, doctor's son, and Uncle Frank is my uncle." And they made him welcome. He stayed there the whole winter. He was only a kid then, about 17. He stayed there the whole winter. And then Uncle Bill McCollum, a brother of the Dr. McCollum, lived on up the road about a half a mile. And they had a big family, young girls and boys. And they just spent the whole winter going in sleds. And they'd go to parties and dances, and they had a good time. So in the spring, Uncle Frank says, "John, what's Bob going to do?" And Bob stayed at Uncle Byron's yet because, they thought there's no use of both of them starting out as pioneers, and then they'd let Bob know later. So Uncle Frank says, "You write down, have him come up too, and we'll get him a job up here too." So when they came up, in the meantime, Uncle Frank says to John, he says, "Where is your family?" He said, "I don't know. I haven't heard from them for 2 or 3 years. I don't know." And, Uncle Frank says, "Did they come back to Waynesburg?" "I don't know." Well, he says, "I'm going down to the mill tomorrow." And he says, "I'll make inquiry." And when he went to the mill, he asked the miller, he said, "Do you know a family by the name of McCollum lives down in here?" And he says, "Well, did the woman marry a doctor, a veterinarian?" "I don't know," Uncle Frank says. Well, he says, "There's a vet lives out on the corner of the next street here by the name of Rose." And he says, "The children go by the name of McCollum." So Uncle Frank came out and made himself known and found out it was John's mother and the family there. And they never notified him that they were moving. So the next morning, John says, "Well, I'm going to go down home." And Uncle Frank says, "Are you sure you want to go?" "Yes." Well, he brought him down in the buggy. And then he joined the family, and he went to work for a meat cutter. And then in the meantime, they sent for Bob to come up, and he was at Uncle Bob before this all happened. After he'd been here all winter, they sent for Bob, and he come up, and then he joined the family. And Bob drove a delivery truck, drove a span of mules, and delivered groceries for Harvey Call Company. And Dad cut meat for a grocer, lived out on that had a store out on South Washington Street. That's where he learned to be a meat cutter. And then they left there and moved. Ma, in the meantime, had got some money from the estate of her husband, and she had built a little house over on the hill, and it wasn't ready for it to be moved into when John joined the family. But when it was finished, they all joined the family, and somehow or other it got on fire. And one comic thing, when they did move over on the hill, the wagon upset, and the cook stove rolled clean down the hill, broke it all to pieces. So they had to buy a new stove before they could even cook. Well, then after that happened, they moved over on Nazar Street. And then Dad went to, I think he went to Hermony, PA, and I was a meat cutter, got a good job down there. And that's where he worked at the time. But just before we were married, he worked at Hermony. But he left, in the meantime, before he left there, though, he worked for a cousin of mine in a plumbing shop. And then he went to Hermony. And then that's where he was when we got married. And then we stayed with my family for a couple of years. And then we moved into town because it was handier for Dad's work. And we lived over in what we call the Kent Cottage. And that's where we moved from over to East Winsburg, where Lloyd was born.
When Bob came up from Uncle Byron's down in West Virginia, he came up to Uncle Frank's.
He came up to Uncle Frank's and stayed. John, in the meantime, came back to Uncle Frank's after he couldn't get a job at first, but after he joined the family, he went back to Uncle Frank's for a year. And that's where Bob came, and then they stayed at Uncle Frank's all that winter. And then they came back down and joined the family, and they got the jobs. They wasn't old enough to have jobs.
And they didn't go back up?
No, they didn't go back up there.
Now, where did you meet him at?
Where did I meet him at? Well, I was going to normal school, teacher's normal school, and my mother called me one Friday, and she says, Lou, do you have enough money with you? Something she wanted, I can't recall now. And I said, I'm not sure, but I'll count. Well, she says, if you do, it was something in the grocery line that she needed. And when I counted, I lacked 23 cents of having enough money. So I went out to my cousin, and I says, Bill, loan me 23 cents. And this young chap was standing there, and Bill says, Gwen Hattie, that was his wife, she was a bookkeeper, and the young fellow says, here's 23 cents. He gave me a quarter. And that's where I met Dad. Borrowed money off him the first time I ever saw him.
You met him for a quarter.
Yes. A couple of years later, then, we were married. And we stayed out at the farm for a couple of years. Dad worked with my dad. They painted and hung paper. And then Dad got a job with a commercial. I think I told that one before, though. And anyway, when John was a year old, we moved into half of John's mother's house. She had half of it, and we had half of it, over on Franklin Street. Then, from there, we moved up onto Fifth Avenue, and we lived up there for a while. Then we moved from there, back down to the Kent house, and lived there a year longer. Then we moved over onto Race Street, where Lloyd was born. And then, by that time, Dad was working still with this man, and when I told him never. And then when we left when Lloyd was just a few weeks old, Dad got a job of cutting meat in Denora. So he went down where his brother Robert lived, and he worked down there all that winter, and I took the two babies and went back out to the farm. And then we moved back. Then from there, we come back to the Kent house again. We liked the Kent house. And that's where we left from and went to Sistersville during the opening of World War I. And was out at the farm, and she was real sick. It was her terminal illness. And so she was, she couldn't walk. She had dropsy. And her feet were swelled, and everything. And Aunt Becky Ryan and Uncle Jonathan came up from Jeanette, and Aunt Becky was grandmother's sister. And so they came up to the farm to see grandmother. And they were going to stay maybe a couple of months. And they were old people too. And Uncle Jonathan drew a government pension. And one morning he come downstairs. He was going home. His pension was due. Well, Aunt Becky thought, well, I'll let him go to town. He'll not go without me. And when Dad, he said, Margaret, will you take me to town? Yes, Dad said, I'll take him. And took him into town and horse and buggy. And when Dad came back, where was Pa? She always called him Pa. And what, Pa went home. And she says, that'll never do, but she says he'll get that check, and he won't know what to do with it, and it will be gone. So she couldn't go to the next day because there's no train out. So the next morning, she had Dad take her into town to go on the 11 o'clock train. And so she said to Mother, I'm not going to let on to live going. She was, grandmother was vague, but she was normal part of the time. They were sisters. Little. Rebecca Little was Aunt Becky's maiden name. That's the one that married Uncle John. And grandmother's name was Lloyd. That's grandmother's mother. Yes, she was Lloyd. Down south someplace. What? I can't tell you exactly. Virginia or someplace down there. It was one of the southern states. So when she was ready to go, she slipped in where grandmother was sitting in a chair, and she just leaned down, kissed her on the forehead, and walked out. And grandmother was sitting in front of the big window in the living room there, and she saw Aunt Becky going across the yard. And she realized that she had kissed her, and it came to her that Becky was going home. And, she just cried and carried on. She yelled for her, and Beck says to Dad, she says, I just want to go to Beck. She said, I can't. And so she did that back again. And they used to live out on the south side. And they had 3 boys. You remember Howard Ryan? He was such a sport, and he married what her name was, Ella Buck, and she was a German girl, and she was up the farm all summer time. And there was something. Uncle Jonathan and Mary. He was from up in here someplace, and how they got to Jeanette, I will never figure out. I never did think to ask how they ever got to Jeanette. Now, see, in those days, Jeanette was a way off, and now it's just about an hour's drive with a car. And so they got down there, and Uncle Jonathan got into school, and he was a maintenance man. And he worked there for years until he retired, and then he got soldiers. They ever got to Now, see, in those days, Jeanette was a way off, and now it's just about an hour's drive with a car. And so we got down there, and Uncle Jonathan got into schools, and he was a maintenance man. And he worked there for years until he retired. And then he got a soldier's pension. So, yes, not pension. And because they lived in here during the war. Uncle Jonathan, I think he was from up and around here someplace. Now, how he got, it might have been during the war that he met her down south. Now, I don't know. That's the end of the story with that. Rebecca Little Ryan. That was my grandmother. Her name was Elizabeth Little Tewksbury. you know, he lived from August until the first of the year. All about this time, gosh, they'd have been 105 or 10 years old. Oh, at that time, they were in their 70s. But my grandmother was the oldest of the family. She was only around 75 when she died, and we thought she was an old woman. Yes, she was down in Virginia, I think it was. And so they were from West Virginia. West Virginia. And grandfather, he served in the Union Army, and he was in prison a year and a day. And that's where that bone charm came from. And he said, and many a time, to get enough to eat, they shackled them together, two to twos. And then they come up to this grill, they call it, and they shoved the tin pans of food in, one for each pan. And he said it was just really a bite on each one. And if your buddy would die, he said he's seen men carry their dead buddies around and pick out his food too, and then that man would be dead for the day before he was done. And he said many a time he wished he was at home with his small barrel to get enough to eat. And then he saw where they wanted waters so very badly, you know, I forget whether that was Andersonville or Libby prison. Then they didn't have water. And they all prayed, and they saw this place in the sand starting to look up. And he said, now that isn't a fish story, that was really true, it's all that. And it just goes for it. And then well, they moved in. Grandmother's house was in the Army. They didn't live in the house that they're in, that you know now. They lived up this way. You remember the old brick house they always called the old swamp house? It's in just about where in the vicinity of you know that service station is this side of the chicken house. No, that's over here. And the old swamp house was over on this side of the road that goes up towards where Dick is. No, the Cordage's tavern's on this side. Yes, it's next to the creek. No, and so that's where grandmother lived, and she just had two children then, Angelina and mother was a baby, and so mother was born in this old swamp house. And he said one time grandfather came home on, it was when he was discharged and he got home. And he got home along in the night. And so Uncle Jim was about 3 years old then. And he wakened up in the morning and saw this strange man in bed with him and his mother, you know. And he shook his mother and he says, Mother, man abed of mother. Man was in bed with his mother. And he said, Dad. They were buried down at Doty'sburg, and after Dad and Mother bought their cemetery lot, they had to move. They moved them from Doty'sburg, and they're buried out there. You know, Anna May is buried on the top. Yeah. Yes, grandmother's mother was a harper. I don't know what harper, only just harper. And they were from Virginia. And so, I can't tell you that. I don't know. All I know is she was a harper. I never inquired about. No. And then when Grandfather and Grandmother Little got too old to take care of themselves, why, the room down east, Grandmother and Grandfather Tewksbury fixed that room for them just to have their sitting room and bedroom and all, and then they would eat out at the table with the other folks, and they took care of them. So one day, Dad and Mother went over, and they all was early, Stephen had a big coal fire, and he says, well, how are you today, Grandfather Little? Oh, I'm not a good, he says. I've got so I can't see. I just can't see. I can't see you. And so they laughed when Dad went out in the other room and said that. And so he says, we think that the old man can see better than he thinks he can. And Dad said, well, now I'll just have a little fun. And he went in and he watched his chance and he slipped a quarter, just a shiny quarter, down, right, back like that. He said, first thing you know, Grandfather had his cane. He was raking that quarter in. he could see the quarter. And her great grandfather was a Harvard. Yeah. John. I'm not talking into this thing. Eliza. She was a Harvard. Was a little. And her daughter was Grandmother Tewksbury. Oh. Okay. That was on Mother's side. Yeah.
Well, then on Grandpa's side, come with that.
Oh, you mean on Grandmother's side? How far back? The grandmother was a Martin, and her mother was a Harper. Let me study this. I don't want that to be registered. Grandmother Douglas, Dad's mother, was Lucinda Martin, and Grandmother Martin was a Woodruff, and her father's name was Demas Woodruff, and they lived down in the old log house where we used to live. And then on Grandfather's side, yes, Grandfather Douglas, why, his father was William Douglas from over around 10 Mile, and I don't know what his mother's name was. But anyway, then later, his mother married a Bain, and that's where Aunt Becky came in, and she's a half-sister to Grandfather Douglas. And no. She was a half-sister to Grandfather Douglas. That is to my grandfather, Jackson. And then Demas Woodruff, that lived down with Grandmother Martin's dad, he was such a man that played practical jokes. And over in the old orchard where the spring used to be, up on the bank there, where he had like a little trolley down, two tracks, and he would cut wood, and he would load a car that he had made on that thing, and roll it down to the house. So one night he'd been out someplace, and he thought he'd rouse them all up when he come in, and he loaded that thing with wood, and instead of guiding it, he had some way to guide it. He just let it come, and he'd come clean in through the door and through the house. with a load of wood. With a load of wood. Yes. He thought that was lots of fun. Well, about the coal bank, along the run back of the house, there was just a small bank, and then on up back of the house, the long old homestead, there was a bank up there, and then they used to go up at the bottom of the Holmes Hill, in the orchard, and there's like a little cove up in there, and they took quite a bit of coal out there, and anybody on the run that wants coal, they just go and dig it, and for school, they learn it. And then if there was an orchard there, and every summer, oh, there's about 8 or 10 trees, and there's berry vines. Everybody went and got apples, berries. Oh, that was a nice little place. And uh, when they became school age, Dad and Uncle John, they were just about a year apart in age. And Uncle John didn't want to go to school, and Dad always wanted his boys to go. And many a morning, Grandmother Douglas followed them clear down to the covered bridge and saw them start up the road to go to school. Over Rough Creek. And then they had just a little old frame church at that time. And I don't know what year. I have a history of it here someplace. I'll give it to you. All the brick church, a new church. And then, do you remember when the church burned? Well, it was one Sunday morning, and they called Dad and said the church was on fire. And Smith Clayton was the sexton then. Well, he had fixed the fire some way, and they never knew what happened, whether the furnace exploded or what, but it got on fire. And Dad took out and up over the hill there. He wouldn't wait to take a horse to go get a horse. He thought he'd get there sooner. And your dad, John, and I walked up on the top of the hill where we could see it, and I never saw a prettier sight in my life. They had like lights up over the church, just like an arch, and every one of those lights, it was as dark, you'd be looking morning, and those lights were all lit up. And then they built, after that, then they built this new church. About 1908 or something like that. 1909. I don't believe he was born at that time. I think John was the baby. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I have a list here. I think I still have it, of all the ministers of the church. Home, maybe 30 or 35. Yeah. And then after we moved to town, your dad joined the Baptist church here. I said the other day, I said, I just love to go back out to the old church again. And what is your church? He said, we don't go to this thing. He said, I went back, and he says, I didn't know anybody. All the old timers were gone. And said, I haven't been out to this church in Dad and I were married out on John, 1970. And so they had a nice wedding, and Russell Burge and Kate Pettit were our attendants, and later they got married. And then all of them, I think they served about 75. They had a turkey dinner for us. And Mac Brister the wedding. And then the serenaders came, and Dad treated them to cigars and candy. And we had to go out on the front porch, and they congratulated us, you know. And just about a couple of weeks later, remember the family of Temples that lived up in the old house? Well, no, of course you wouldn't. Anyway, this girl, there was a girl in the family, and she come down one day and she says, I've got a favor to ask of you. And so I says, what is it? She says, would you let me be married in your wedding dress? She's going to be married. And I said, well, yes, you can be married in it. And she said, well, do you care if she hadn't asked my mother. She said, do you care if I'm married down at your house? Why, no. Mother said, you can be married down here. And Grandpa was a justice of the peace, and he married them. And say she was just as happy as she could be. She had the big white dress on and everything, you know. And so anyway, Mother was so afraid that she would go home wearing that dress. And she says, Mattie, you can't wear that dress out. You have to change your clothes. Oh, she says, I love my going away dress. And I don't know where they went. They went someplace for a wedding trip. Dad and I lived out there. I should say my husband and I lived out there for a couple of years. John was, John was born out there. And then we stayed out there about a year after he was born. And then we moved in over on Franklin Street in the little Kent cottage, you know. And that's where we live. Huh? Then we moved from the Kent cottage over to on Race Street where you were born. Yeah, we lived there 2 different times at the Kent house. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then we moved back to Kent on Fifth Avenue. That's when we moved back to the Kent cottage. We moved from Race Street up to Fifth Avenue, and then from there back down to the Kent house cottage, and then from there we went to West Virginia. We was in West Virginia that winter, and in the spring, Dad says, well, he's got a job in the greenhouse down there. And he says, well, if I'm going to have a job here, I might as well go up and get the furniture and move the furniture down. And he came back, got leave off for a week, and he came back and he packed the furniture, and he went over the little WW, and then we got the little cottage, you know, where we lived there, back from the greenhouse on from Uncle Tommy's, and we lived there. We must have lived there a couple of years, and then we moved. He got a job then with the Carter Oil Company, and we moved up into Streetsville on the hill. Mm-hmm. Into Youngstown. When more early, we sold her furniture up there, and you remember that poor old woman that lived all out around the hill? Piano tunes, sold the furniture, and Mrs. Maley bought the piano, and you know how they moved it? They had a man come with a sled, and they moved that piano on the sled. And upright piano. And then we got up early to get the early train to Youngstown, and the people that had bought the rest of the furniture let us keep the furniture until we left that morning, you know, so we'd have some place to sleep. And we took the 8 o'clock train, and I know we stopped over across to bid the old woman across the street, Mrs. Adkins, goodbye. And so then she was a big, fleshy lady, and she was the nicest old soul. And then we took the 8 o'clock train, and we never got to Youngstown till a long 11 o'clock that night, and Percy and Bernsey and John Ashton came down to the station to meet us, and we went up to their house, and we stayed up there for, I expect a couple of months. It was during just the opening of the war, the beginning of the war, and you just couldn't go anyplace. And if we found out you had children, oh no, you didn't have children. And I know one evening we went down to see the boys in train to go to camp, and there was over 300 went from Youngstown at one bunch. They lived down on Hillman. And they lived there. And the little house that they bought then was up. That was Hillman, wasn't it? Yeah, they lived in an apartment at first where we went that over old Finn's grocery. And then they bought this little house out on Hillman, and I walked the streets with you two boys till it's wondered we all had a drop. We'd watch the paper the night before where they had rooms, and they'd say no phone calls, you'd have to go. And we would walk and we'd walk. And then when they'd see you two kids, we shut the door. And so anyway, we saw, that wasn't a very good recommendation, was it? So then we at last got up at Grandma. Granny Hills, and we got the ground floor up there, and we lived there, and we had to share. We had four rooms, and then there's a family with 5 children lived on the 2nd floor, and we had to share a bath and toilet down in the basement. You never know what to do when you're going to get in or out. And so one night, we heard a lot of commotion up there. That's when the flu was so bad. That was 1918. And the flu was so bad, and the people who lived upstairs in the attic. And in the meantime, John Jr. got pneumonia. And there's an old German doctor, Dr. McCollum, and he was very good. And we didn't think he was going to make it, but he did. And Grandma Douglas came through to help take care of him because we was all just worn out. And we had lived there a year, and you remember the little house right in the corner of the yard? And the well, we all got drinking water at the well, which was at the end of our porch. And we would all 3 meet over there, maybe at the same time to get water. Nobody would speak to either. You speak to people then. And when this woman in the little cottage came over one morning while I was out, she said, I understand you have a very sick child. I said, yeah. Well, she said, is there anything I can do? And I told her no. And she was the nicest lady I think we ever had. And we lived there a year before we ever spoke to each other. And then we went and had a little a store about a block and a half away where we got our groceries. Nobody delivered groceries then. We had to go way up there. But and then you couldn't get the white flour. And Dad worked out at the rubber works, and that's where he found. You remember one morning he found the camel brooch? Well, he found the camel brooch. And the office place, it was an Italian settlement that he had to go through to get to the works. And I think every family had a goat. And every family had a great big crocheted piece at their door glass. And you'd walk out through there, and the goats didn't bother you. We'd take walks out there, and everything. And then we'd walk out some evenings to meet Dad, and he's coming from work in about a mile and a half out. And then one night, you got sick. We was worried to death here you were going to get. You just had a bad cold. And then one time that I remember was so funny, you folks got to throwing stones at the truck driver. Yeah. One afternoon, I heard you fellows coming running around the walk, and the truck driver had got out of the truck, and he was chasing you. And if that door had been locked, you'd have been a goner. Well, you come in, you got in the house, and run and jumped under the bed. And then another thing that was kind of odd or strange, we couldn't get white flour, and we would take dark flour and rolled oats and everything to put in to make bread, and it was awful mess to try to eat you ever saw, but it's all we had. So about once a week, Aunt Bernsey would call over. They lived about 3 miles away from us, and she would call over once a week, and she'd say, "You and the boys come over this evening." Well, for the first time or two, I didn't know what she wanted us to come over for, and she had baked bread, and the most beautiful white bread, great big loaves, and she had 2 loaves of bread for me. Well, then I was scared to go home on the streetcar. We weren't supposed to have white bread, but in a big bag, nobody ever bothered us. And all that winter, we had white bread. And I said to Percy one day, "How does it come that you folks get white bread instead of the dark? Don't you have to use that too?" "Not me," he says, "I won't eat that stuff." And I said, "Well, what do you do without it?" Well, he worked in the machine shop through the day. Then after he would quit at 5 o'clock, he would drive a truck and deliver groceries for another, Percy was an Englishman, and there's another Englishman that he drove truck for this little grocery. And every time that Percy would get his groceries on Saturday, he had them in one of those big long delivery boxes, and in the bottom of that box was a 25-pound bag of white flour. And he says, I would leave it off at the house and take the whole thing in. He says, if anybody had ever gone to our attic, he says, it'd have been too bad. He says, we never had under 18 or 20 bags of flour up in that attic, and sugar, too. And I says, well, how come we have to eat this stuff? Why, we were sending all the white flour to England. The English people wouldn't eat that black stuff, and we were sending them our white flour, and we had to eat the black bread. So. Then we moved from Granny Hills. One night we heard such a commotion upstairs, and so it developed that this Mr. Laddick was very, very sick. He had taken the flu. Well, we was ready to move the next morning anyway, and we'd got this little cottage over on the east side, and we moved over there. And then we came home. The schools closed after we moved over there, and we all came back to the farm, thinking if we would stay up there for a few weeks till the flu would get settled a little bit. And while we were up here, we had the armistice was declared, and they celebrated down at the fairground here in Waynesburg with a big ox roast. And then after school, Grandpa, he was teaching at Sycamore then, and he come on in to be here after school came, and he got a piece of the ox too, And when time came to go home, why, before we all wanted to go though, Grandmother says, I'm going to take Dad's cart and horse, and the boys can with me if they want to, and I'll go home and take care of and milk the cows. Well, you didn't want to go, but John did, so he went with Grandma, and they got home. So we left about 8 o'clock, got out by Fairview Schoolhouse, and the car broke down, and we pulled it into we're just up on the place where we could pull it and push it into the yard up there where you used to live. And we all started to walk home. That was about 3 miles. By that time, it's about 11 o'clock. You were just a little fella. You gave out. You couldn't walk that far. So Dad carried you on his back. And when we got home, we just were so tired. And when we got home, their Grandma and John, they'd been home. They was in there good and snug, you know. So then the next morning, Dad and Clyde, came back, and there wasn't anything very seriously wrong with the car, but they got the car and got us home.
What year was that?
1918. And then we went home. Ethel and Paul and Norman also was at the farm, and Dad, and they came from Newcastle because the schools were shut down, and they was there for about a couple of weeks. And your dad and Norman hunted rabbits, and one week we just ate the good sections out of it. One week we ate 32 rabbits. We would bake them in a great big pan with pork, and have mashed potatoes and squash, and Grandma had a cane mill, and she had cane molasses, and we'd make gingerbread, and we had a nice time. Well, we decided then, we were notified that the schools had reopened, or would reopen, and we went back to Youngstown, back to the little cottage, and you boys started to school. And a couple of 3 mornings after you started to school, the teacher called one day, and she says, "Mrs. McCollum, you better come and get John. He's sick." So I went up to the school, and I got John down home, and he was sick. Put him to bed, and you stayed till lunchtime. And when you came home for lunch, you didn't want to go back because John was sick. You wanted to stay home that afternoon. Well, by that time, I was in bed with John. I got headachy, and I felt so bad, and we was both in bed. Well, you got your own lunch. What you got, I don't know, but we were just sick. We didn't pay any attention to that. And you had a good time playing. You made one of those little airplanes out of paper where you'd fold it into like a section, you know, and you'd whirl it through the air. I was in a doze, and you hit me. One of them hit me on the nose, and it scared me. And you know, by 2 o'clock, you was in bed with us, just sick as you could be, and you'd been perfectly all right. When Dad came for work that night, there we were, 3 of us piled up in bed. He called for poor old Dr. Mahard, and Dr. Mahard says, "Mr. McCollum, I will be there, but I don't know when." He said, "I don't know which way to turn. There's so many sick." And that night at 11 o'clock, he came, and by that time, he said, "I'm afraid this boy is going into pneumonia." That was you. And all the medicine he gave you was every so often, every so many half hours or something, we gave you a half of an aspirin tablet. And we kept you out of pneumonia. And Dad, then he felt bad, and the doctor says, "Well, Mr. McCollum, you don't try to work. You stay here and take care of these sick people. You have no business out anyway." And so Dad nursed us for about a week, and we all got over it. But we ran from the flu and went home and got it. And that seemed funny. So anyway, we was lucky though. One time across in that little new development back from our house, at one time we counted 8 wreaths. That's when they put wreaths on the door. We counted 8 wreaths. It was a little new development on doors from the flu. And when we got it, we was too sick to worry whether we was going to die or not.
Who was it died that under here?
Huh?
Who was it died in the family that you were telling?
Oh, yes. One morning, while we were still housed up with the flu, Aunt Bernsey came over with John Ashton, and she was on her way to the train. And she says, I just wanted to tell you, we got word last night at midnight that Helen Allen has died, and we're going. That was Aunt Molly's little girl. And so they come over, and a month later, Mary died. But they didn't have the flu. They had typhoid fever. And Aunt Bernsey, she says, is there anything I can do for you? She says, I'm not going to run into the flu, but if you need anything, I will come in. But we were getting better by that time. And then she stayed at Waynesburg until those two little girls, they both died. But to drink so badly. He just worshipped those two babies. So well, there's 4 and 6. And they said that, oh gosh. I just
well, after we speak then, okay. How long did you do that?
Oh, that when we was at the farm.
Yeah.
Then after we came back to the farm, after the armistice was signed, you see that we had no job, because as soon as the armistice was signed, they had no reason to make war material, which Dad was making.
Just a minute, how long did you live in Youngstown altogether, those places?
About 3 or 4 years. We lived in Youngstown about 3 or 4 years, and in the meantime, we'd started to build a house out at Kirkwood Terrace. And when the armistice was signed, we had no job, we had no nothing. So we come back to the farm, and Dad said he could always get work back here. And so when we came back to the farm, Dad didn't know what he was going to work at, but he was going to try to come to town, contact some people. So Grandpa was papering and painting. And he said, John, you can work with me. He says, make you some money so you can locate something. So one day in town, Dad, my husband, ran across Bill Randolph. And Bill says, are you back here? He says, yes. What are you doing? Working with my father-in-law. You looking for a job? Yes. You got one. He says, I'll hire you. And he worked for Bill for 3 or 4 years. But in the fall, work would shut up because everybody just didn't have anything done in the winter. It didn't work through the winter like they do now. And then Dad got a job down on South Morgan Street at a little broom factory. Made all the way to $15 a week, but we tied it over. And by the next Christmas, when he went back to work at the broom factory when the painting had shut up, why, I got the bright idea that I'd like to have some Christmas money. And I went to work to 5 and 10. You don't understand. So then from there, I got a job at Grossman's. And I worked up there until they had the big fire. I must have worked up there, 4 or 5 years. And then we moved from the Staggers house down to where we are now on South Cumberland Street. Grandma owned that house. And she says, you might as well live in there. And so we moved down here. And then Wayne was born down here. And the boys went to school out here at you went to Barterville, Miller, didn't you? And then John, in the meantime, Lloyd and Aldine got married, and they didn't finish school. And so then John, he finished high school. And a week from the day Grandma says, though, when Lloyd and Aldine eloped, she said, now, when you come back, don't say anything, because she says they're married, and she says, just accept it. So all that I hated about it was that Lloyd didn't get his education. Aldine was a wonderful little girl. So, and at the farm, Mother was so very, very sick, and she says, I want to have a dinner out here for Lloyd and Aldine. And they fixed a date as on the following Sunday, and she had her dinner and for them. And the next Sunday, Mother was buried, and she wanted that dinner so very much. And then Dad and in the meantime, Dad went into a little business project, him and Lou Ramsey. And they started into a little wallpaper store on the second floor of the Opera House building. And Lou lived in Bentleyville, him and his family. And he came over, and they decided they was going to make a little go of it, you know. And in the meantime, they paint between times. So, and Lou's family came on from Bentleyville, and he got rooms for them. But until that, for about a month or 6 weeks, till they could get rooms for his family, he stayed with us. And so then his family moved on here. And then from that, they went on down in a bigger place on South Washington Street. And they decided that it wasn't paying enough to sustain 2 families. So Lou says, I'll give or take. Well, Dad says, I'll take. So Dad bought Lou out. And then Dad started the framing business. And that's what he was doing when the fire was. And the day of the fire, it was a 0 day. And he had a big job of framing for the gas company from Mannington. Each year, they had so many merits that they framed. And he said, you suppose you can make it up in the afternoon if it's so slippery? He says, I don't believe I can get those pictures back in. The man was wanted them for the next day. So I went out the alleyways and up to the school building and got up there without falling. And I backed those pictures in. We had them all finished that night. It was just a little less than $100 job. And that looked pretty good in midwinter, you know. That night the fire was, wiped it all out. And so then we moved what we could salvage down here at the shop, and we made quite a little bit off of just remnants, you know, and things like that. Because sell it cheap, people would buy them, and it was better than throwing it out. And then we kept on that way until Dad's death, and until just about a couple of years before he died, he would still frame.
About how long did you were born in the old log cabin?
Yes.
About how long did you live there before they built the new house?
Oh gosh, I was a young woman. I was 14 years old when they built the new house. And
who built
they built the new house, a big 6-room with 2 verandas, a big back porch. And the man furnished the material and built the house in those days for $2,000. Big slate roof. Yes, Isaac Clayton built the house. It was from down to Picasso. And Mother boarded the men that summer. And we lived in the old house, and they slept in the upstairs in the loft, you know. We had a nice bedroom up there. But imagine a 6-room house with a slate roof and everything for $2,000. And today, I suppose, a house like that, you couldn't build it for much less than $10,000 or $12,000. And now what?
You moved into the new house then?
About 1900, and we burned wood and coal until that following year, and Gilbert Zimmerman plumbed the house for gas. And then we had gas. And then later, they put electric in it. And then after Grandma's death, Grandpa and Aunt Ethel lived there. And sometimes Grandpa would be there for several weeks at a time because she would go with her husband on his rounds, you know. He was a piano tuner. And so we all got along good. And every Sunday, when Ethel would be away, we'd have Grandpa in here for dinner. He'd come from church. And I'll have to tell you one little thing that it's taught me a lesson. One Sunday, it was so terribly hot, and after dinner was over, we were sitting on the front porch, and they didn't have garbage pickup then. And anybody that had a barrel that wanted to pick up garbage, they'd pick it up and take it out for their hogs. So there was a poor old colored man driving a mule coming down the street with barrels. He had a couple of barrels in the little back part of his wagon. And you could see the flies and everything. I said, oh, isn't that awful? That oughtn't to be allowed. And Dad looked at me and he said, Lou, do you just stop to think for a minute? Maybe that's the only way that poor old man can make his living. And that taught me a lesson. Don't judge things. And
Well, Grandpa, what education did he have?
what?
Grandpa, what education did he have?
What education? Teachers college.
Where was that?
Teachers college. He had 8th grade, and then he went to college up here. And him and Grandma both went up here to college.
Grandma, his wife?
And so
Did he graduate?
she never taught, because before she got her diploma, they got married. And then that winter, they stayed out at Grandpa Douglas's, the winter they were married. And my dad taught school, and he made all the way to $40 a month teaching school.
How long did he have to go to college?
I think about 2 years. It's just like going to the California State College, only they had the thing up here. Had the same thing up here. And then by that time, we were living over on Race Street, and Aunt Ethel and Margaret Holmes and several of the local girls wanted to make some money, and they came in and got a job at the tin mill, stacking the tin, wore big heavy gloves. Well, then Norman McKissick, he was here from Newcastle working in the machine shop part, and they met, and they fell in love, and they eloped. Ethel was a little past 16. Well, how she got her clothes out, we never could figure out till after they were married. And she had packed her suitcase and took it out at the back, and Norman was there to get it, and they took the next morning train. Well, the next morning I called out. I called out that at night at the farm, and I said, Ethel has come in. No, she was there. She went out the next morning. But I said, she hasn't come in from work, and I'm kind of worried. And Dad come in, and he was going on the hunt over, And by that time, his telephone message came from Newcastle. They didn't have to have blood tests then in those days. They could just go and get a license and get married. They left here on the 6:25 train in the morning and got married in Pittsburgh and went on to Newcastle and called back and that they were married. And so then she come home. In the meantime, John Jr. had milk infection so bad. That was the summer before you was born, in the fall. And he was very, very sick. And one Saturday afternoon, I saw someone coming up the lane from the other street, and here came Ethel. And she had a teddy bear half as tall as herself. And she didn't know that John was sick, but she brought him the teddy bear. And I think from that minute the baby started to get better because he was so enthused about it. Well, she called out the farm and said that she came for over the weekend, and Norman had 2 days off the next week, and he was going to come the next week and meet the folks, And so they got along fine then. They went back to Newcastle, and Norman had such a good job. And when men here were making $3 and $4 a day, Norman was pulling down $20 in his machine shop. And then they had Paul, and then Lloyd was born that fall. And then Lloyd was born in November, and the following April, Paul was born. So Grandma went to Newcastle to be there with Ethel. And so when Norman was about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years old. No, he's older than that. He's about 5 or 6. Norman went out hunting, groundhog hunting one day.
You mean when Paul was over?
Huh?
You mean when Paul was there?
Yes. When Paul was 5 or 6 years old. And so they got a telephone message one Saturday afternoon that Norman had got shot and killed. Well, they came in, Dad and Mother, and they took the evening train and went to Newcastle. And Mother they she was so excited when they got this message. Mother got it into her head it was Ethel that got shot. But it was Norman. He was out groundhog hunting with some pals that he worked with, and when he went to get over the fence, his gun went off and shot him through the chest. And when the coroner came, they said he didn't have a drop of blood left in his body. And so then Ethel and Paul came back to the farm. And
what year was that about?
So after Norman was buried, Ethel and Paul came back home. She brought her car. That's the way they all came back home then, Grandpa and Grandma. And she had sold her furniture and settled up the funeral affairs. And in a week's time, they were back home. So Paul then went to school over at Rough Creek, and Ethel stayed at the farm, and she would work different places. She was a practical nurse. And they stayed out there until John Shaw came on the scene. And Ethel and John had been boyhood and girlhood sweethearts. And when they came back, they renewed the acquaintance. And in about 3 or 4 years after Norman had died, they got married. But it just didn't turn out right. When they wanted to go to housekeeping, John didn't want to take Paul. Ethel said, "I'll never go and have a home without my child." So they just more or less drifted apart from then on.
How long did we live at the Staggers house?
We was there 3 or 4 years. And then we moved down here. Then I was 6 years old when my grandmother Douglas died. And at that time, we were living down in the old log house. That's where I was born. And I know the day she was buried, they had the casket in front of the mantel in that front room. Coffins, they call them then, where it went down a little at the bottom. And I sat on my dad's lap. And I wondered, I couldn't understand why my dad was crying. And I knew there was something odd, but I didn't know what had happened to Grandmother. So when they got down, I believe it was just about this time of year in March that she was buried. And when they got down to Lippincott, to the cemetery down there back of the little church, they put the coffin down with big wide bands. They didn't have machinery. And one end slipped and let that coffin fall and break the glass all over, and just went all over her face, just down the waist side where the glass was. They had to get that coffin up out of there, take it in the church. The people waited in the church till a man came to Waynesburg on horseback to get another glass to put in that coffin. And I can remember yet, when that coffin dropped, I can remember my dad, how he cried. And so then, after that, sometime after that, a few months after that, Grandfather Douglas married a second time, and which was his third wife. I'll get back to that in a minute and tell you about the first wife. And so...
You're going to run out of time.
Grandfather Douglas's first wife was Matilda Martin, a sister to his second wife, which was Lucinda. And then for his third wife, he married Mary Bell from over at Dunn Station.
Your grandpa Douglas lived in this house about how long?
Oh, he lived here 8 or 10 years. He used to live all over on Montgomery Avenue, and he had a chance to buy this house, which was a bigger place, so he bought this.
And then he died here?
He died here and was buried from here, and Mary died from here and was buried from here.
Where is she buried?
She's buried over at Rough Creek.
Where he is?
She's buried over there.